Welcome to my site. This is part 6 in my series about long lost Oldham pubs. Hope you enjoy. And please don't forget, like, subscribe and hit that notification bell for when I upload the next video. This pub was certainly in existence by 1802, when it was called the Jolly Hatters. However, Edwin Butterworth, writing in 1856, states that prior to 1765, a Mr. John Fletcher had a small hat factory between the top of Water Street and the top of Bent, so an alehouse called the Jolly Hatters could have opened around then. In 1886, Alfred Swales took over after running the Beaver Inn down the street, where he had not been happy. Perhaps because of this, and to avoid the confusion of having two pubs of virtually the same name on the same street, the Wine and Spirits Wholesalers and the Beaver's Vaults at 1 and 3 Manchester Street became the 1 and 3. In 1989, Billy Brown, the longest serving licensee since Joseph Beavers, moved to the Queen Inn, Oldham Road, Ashton, and the 1 and 3 closed for a complete refitting. It is still closed in late 1992. Rumour has it that when the new town square is nearly ready, Marstons may burst into life and get to work on the pub. During a full licence application for the Live and Let Live, now the Turn of Luck, in 1896, it was stated that no full licences had been granted in the Clodic area for 100 years. This suggests that the Ordnance Arms opened at the end of the 18th century or earlier, but the pub's official licensing date is 1829. The records are vague for the last 15 years, but things became clear with the 1829 survey. The Ordnance Arms was then owned by the executors of John Taylor, and the licensee was Isaac Clegg. Harry Crowther was the licensee during the alterations, and he stayed for 11 years. The next licensee, Herbert Bottomley, was at the Ordnance Arms for nearly twice as long. Next came Harry Whitnell, Jr. for 16 years. Boddington's Brewery took over Oldham Brewery in 1982, and as promised, closed, albeit 5 years later. The Ordnance Arms saw several changes of licensee after that, and then in early 1992 the pub was up for sale. The buyer was a company called Paramount plc. On the 8th of February 1871, Mr. Mellor, an architect of 8 Suffolk Street, Wearmouth, applied for planning permission to build a dwelling house and outbuildings in Oxford Street. Permission was granted and the house was built for Mr. Richard Compton of Old Lane then. A year or two later, Thomas Lees purchased the building, obtained a licence and called the house the Oxford Hotel. The Oxford had a few short tenancies and then Arthur Brown took the licence in 1939. He stayed for 23 years, a record for the pub. Mind you, Bob Barker took over in 1979 and he is still there, so Arthur's record could be broken in 2003. This public house began life as the Cheshire Cheese, kept by Andrew Mannock in 1784 to 86. James Tallow had taken over the alehouse at Coppice Nook by 1828 and he gave it the sign of the Plough, the name it bears today. In 1968 they rebuilt the Plough. The first manager was Alan Entwistle, who came from the old mess house and ran the new pub for 8 years. He then went to the Hathershaw Hotel, where sadly he died. The new Plough was not the success that Whitbread had expected it to be, and they changed the pub from a managed house to a tenancy. Then in 1991 the brewery decided to sell the pub. For some reason the auction did not take place and the Plough remained a Whitbread house until 1992 when it was bought by the licensee Paul Roberts. On the 12th of April 1804, the Duke of Gloucester and his son, Prince William, reviewed the local volunteer corps, including the Oldham Volunteers, on Sale Moor, Cheshire. In the same year, John Skellhorn opened the Prince William of Gloucester public house in the marketplace. William Skellhorn, son of John and Mally, was a member of the local militia and was a master drummer, but in 1811 he was reduced to the ranks for ignorance. Perhaps William used to drum in the volunteers outside the Prince William, and that is how the pub got its nickname, the Top Drum. The Prince William of Gloucester closed on the 12th of May 1972. The building remained empty for a time and rumour had it that the NatWest Bank was going to take it over temporarily. Then in 1974 the Victoria Market was destroyed by fire and the pub was given a new lease of life as the Market Hall. When the temporary market building was put up, the Top Drum was no longer of use and so it was demolished. At a special licensing session in 1864, the owners of the Punch Bowl applied to rebuild the pub. It was stated that it was perhaps one of the oldest public houses in Oldham, and if it were not rebuilt, there was a danger of the building coming down. The Punch Bowl was indeed old, and it can be traced back to 1743, when it was kept by John Neal. John Neal died on the 27th of June 1782, aged 59. His wife Anna took over the licence of the Bull's Head until about 1788. When Mark Neal was in charge, it was probably Mark who changed the name to the Punch Bowl. Back in court in 1868 and 1869, the arguments about the new building dragged on. In the latter years, John Nichols told the magistrates, "I wish you would take the licence and the house." The magistrates were apparently just as fed up as he was, and obliged. The Punch Bowl was subsequently converted into a grocer's shop run by James Cooper. At a later date, a bank was built on the site, and in recent years the building was taken over by Dulces Limited. In 1829, the building on the corner of Royton Road, later Rochdale Road, and Featherstone Road was owned and occupied by John Taylor. It was then being used as a hat shop. There was stabling in the yard at the back. In 1855, the building became a public house called the British Queen. Anne Holt was the first licensee. Then a year later, James Harrop took over. James left in 1864 after being fined 10 shillings for serving beer on a Sunday morning. Edward Barlow moved from the Junction, later Featherstone and Junction, on Featherstone Road to the British Queen in 1870, and the pub may have been rebuilt at this time. Edward renamed it the Queen's Hotel and obtained a music licence. When Reynold Clegg took over the licence in 1961, he introduced live country and western music in the back concert room. Major alterations were made in 1974 when the Queen's was given an open plan look, which was more suitable for concerts. Ronald died in 1976 and his wife took over, and he introduced a full restaurant service in 1982. Today, the Queen's is owned by a subsidiary company of Grand Metropolitan. Between 1788 and 1793, Thomas Rowe kept the Hat Inn at Chadderton, and someone of the same name owned the Coach and Horses, the original name for the Queen's. In 1829, the innkeeper was then John Tetlow, a farmer. By 1851, Ashton had renamed the pub the Queen's Hotel. Trade at the Queen's suffered back in the rock and roll years of the 1950s, when many young drinkers saw entertainment in the pubs. However, and the pub closed for good in 1970. The site is now an open space. The old Church Inn, later the Radcliffe Arms, stood on the corner of Rope Street and opened in 1823. Harold Harrison took over at the Radcliffe Arms in 1934 and stayed until 1950, earning himself the distinction of being the longest serving licensee up to that date. This record was broken by Stanley Harrison, who took over from his father and ran the pub until 1968. Edith Harrison took over from Stanley, and she saw the pub through a major refit in 1972. Next came Trevor Harrison, who was in charge when the Radcliffe Arms closed in December 1978. Trevor moved with the licence to the Tommyfield on New Radcliffe Street, which had been built by J.W. Lees to replace the Radcliffe. The story of the Railway Inn starts in 1782, when James Kay kept an alehouse on Chapel Croft. In 1795, Rowbottom noted that Mr. Kay was granted a licence for a pub on the New Road, Manchester Street, and the sign he chose was the Punch Bowl. James Tetlow gave his name to Tetlow Street at the side of the pub. For some reason, he moved to the building on the other corner, number 255 Manchester Street, in 1842, obtained a beerhouse licence and called this the Antelope Inn. George T. Whitbread took over at the old pub, and as James had taken his sign with him, he had to find another name. He didn't have to look far. The railway line had just been completed to Oldham station, now Wearmouth, so the pub became the rail. Not many of Oldham Brewery's tenants stayed longer than a few years at the railway, so trade mustn't have been too good. The exceptions were Hindley and then Ellen Ross, who between them kept the pub for 18 years until 1927. Trade improved after the Second World War, but in the 1960s plans to widen Manchester Street were announced as part of the bypass scheme first put forward in 1935. The railway was a victim of the road widening, closing on the 26th of April 1969. The building was pulled down in 1970, but we are still waiting for the road to be widened. The Railway and Commercial stood on the corner of Railway Road and Pass Street, facing the main entrance to Wearmouth Station, and opened in 1852. It was built by Joseph Pass, who had the licence until 1855, and gave his name to the side street. Joseph Cheetham, who took over in 1856, got himself into trouble on 2 occasions. In that year, he was fined 10 shillings for serving beer on a Sunday morning. 5 years later, he was summoned for the same offence and cautioned that if he was caught again, he might lose his licence. The railway and commercial was going through a bad patch when Joseph Weil was in charge in the 1860s. He was refused a music licence. In 1869, after police told the magistrates that the pub was frequented by thieves and prostitutes. There had been reports of women dancing on tables. William Taylor took the licence in 1870 and promised to clean the pub up, get some order in the place. The magistrates must have approved of William, as they granted him a music licence. Stopford's brewery was taken over by Walker and Humphrey in 1927, and the railway and commercial lasted another 8 years under the Salford's firm. The pub was referred to the Compensation Authority in April 1935, and compensation was set at £2,230 for the brewery and £20 for the tenant. The licence lapsed on the 16th of July. A lot of the information that I got for this video comes from this excellent book by Rob McGee. Oh, and please don't forget, like, subscribe and hit that notification bell to be aware of next time I upload one.